Hi everyone, my name is Kevin Lings. I'm the Chief Economist at Standlib, and I just want to take up a few minutes of your time to give you a sense of what the Minister of Finance said at the budget this afternoon. I think this is his fifth budget. There were no interruptions, no shouting out from the floor, no dissent from the political parties within the GNU. So all of that a lot better than what occurred last year. And obviously, the budget details had been circulated amongst the GNU members in order to get a broader consultation and in order to get buy-in. So, from our perspective, that's a good outcome. Also, if I look at the main content within the budget, pretty much in line with expectations. I would argue from our perspective, there were no shocks. There was nothing in it that really surprised us. So what is it that the minister is focused on? Primarily, he's focused on fiscal discipline. And I'll take you through 6 things that I would say that are articulated well in the budget, that come across very clearly, and I think in combination allow you to sort of recognize that the government is primarily trying to be disciplined. And then beyond that, obviously, he has to focus on a couple of other issues. But if you look at the changes to the taxes, they were very modest changes. He was able to provide some tax relief for individuals in terms of the impact of fiscal drag, and that's good. There were no big tax increases. There was an increase in some of the so-called sin taxes and in the fuel levy road accident fund. But in terms of percentages, those I would say are very modest, and there were no shock tax announcements. And from our perspective, that's a very good thing. So, what is it that the minister really is achieving here in terms of fiscal discipline? As I said, 6 things. Let's go through them fairly quickly. The first, he's able to reduce the budget deficit. So, previously, he was looking at a deficit of 4.5% of GDP. He's now projecting that down to 4%, and I think that is achievable. And clearly, that's a move in the right direction. Is that far enough? No. Ideally, you want the deficit to be less than 3%, but it wasn't that long ago. South Africa was sitting with a deficit up at over 6% of GDP. So the move is clearly in the right direction, and I would say there would be a high level of confidence that we'll make further progress in terms of getting the fiscal deficit even lower. The second clear indication of fiscal discipline is a peaking out of the debt to GDP ratio. Remember that for years, in a number of years in a row, the debt level kept rising, certainly as a percentage of GDP, creating even more concerns and resulting ultimately in the credit rating downgrades. Well, the minister has now announced that it certainly would appear that the debt to GDP ratio has peaked. It did peak at a higher level than what was anticipated, just over 78% of GDP. So the number is exceptionally high. And I think it went up partly because the nominal GDP level is not going up quite as much as what was anticipated because of the lower inflation. So in effect, it's one of the negatives of getting inflation lower. Your debt to GDP ratio doesn't look as encouraging. Plus, if I look at the various areas of government borrowing, there was a sizable increase in some of the categories, but the minister did make the point that the government borrowed more than what was anticipated because there was a good opportunity for them to borrow. That puts them in a good position going into this year, in that I don't think they have to borrow quite as much. And so you're going to see the debt to GDP ratio come down quite measurably. And on the basis of the projection, it does look as if we'll be able to get the debt to GDP ratio to move systematically in the right direction. Obviously, it's going to take some time before it is ultimately at the level that is okay for an emerging market, but I think it's a clear move in the right direction. The third area of fiscal discipline is obviously the primary budget surplus. We know that we have moved into a primary budget surplus. Just to remind people, that is where you look at revenue less expenditure, but you exclude the interest cost of debt. Now, the interest cost of debt is an enormous number, so I'm not saying you must exclude it. I'm just saying it's a measure of ongoing or underlying fiscal discipline. And the fact that we've generated another primary budget surplus, 0.9% of GDP, and the fact that we anticipate that primary budget surplus to get even bigger next year, up to 1.6% of GDP. That's unquestionably an area of discipline and clearly something the credit rating agencies will take on board. And I'll chat about what this means for our credit rating in a sec. The fourth area I think that is disciplined is the fact that government expenditure in total is only going up at around about 3.5%. Think about the last time government budgeted for a modest 3.5% increase in expenditure. Now, there are a number of people that are going to actually be quite unhappy with that because they would have wanted more allocation to healthcare, more allocation to education, etc., etc. But this is a government that wants to control the overall expenditure number, and 3.5% will do that. And it's also him acknowledging that the inflation target is now lower at 3%, and therefore he is contributing to South Africa's ability to achieve the inflation target. He's also got the benefit that the multi-year wage agreement has now ended. And so when I look at what he's put in for wage increases over the next couple of years, it is a much more modest increase and an increase that reflects more the 3% inflation target than what we had previously. So from that perspective, you would say it is ongoing discipline. The fifth area I think that is very important here is the interest cost of debt. And I want to give you a number that I think if you followed the budget numbers, you'd be shocked by it. And that is the interest cost of debt goes up. You would expect that. But how much is it going up by? Right now, the minister is budgeting for an increase of 2.8%. 2.8. Now, if you go back just a couple of years, the interest cost of debt in South Africa was typically going up 15%, 18% a year. It was the fastest growing area within the budget, undoubtedly. Now, because we've got a lower inflation target, we've been more disciplined, the bond yield has come down, it means that we're starting to finally get the benefit of fiscal consolidation. And so the interest cost of debt is one of the slowest increasing areas within the budget. And I would think that's a huge benefit. And obviously, over time, that will make a bigger difference to the government's overall fiscal position. And then finally, the sixth area of fiscal discipline is the minister saying that in the October budget this year, which will come out in October, we hope, is that the fiscal anchor will be introduced. Now, the fiscal anchor, think about inflation targeting at the Reserve Bank level. In other words, the Reserve Bank says, I've got a target and my policy is directed to achieve that target. Well, many countries do the same thing for government spending and government debt. You set fiscal anchors or fiscal rules. And so the government's been working on this for some time. And what they're saying is they are in a position to introduce fiscal anchors or fiscal rules in October this year. And I think that would be well accepted, certainly by the bond market and by international investors, because it then tells everybody where the guidelines are. What are you aiming to achieve over what time period? And then you're committing yourself to not simply take on more debt or simply increase expenditure excessively, because clearly then you won't achieve the fiscal parameters. So if you put it all together, that to me is the main essence of what the budget was about today. And so it sets up us for an environment where later this year, and I'm thinking after the October medium-term budget, we could expect a credit rating upgrade. Now, S&P already upgraded us last year. They put us on a positive outlook. So potentially they could follow through on that positive outlook and upgrade us again. That would not be impossible given what the minister set up and assuming that they introduce the fiscal anchor in October this year. Outside of those factors, what do I think is going on elsewhere in the budget? The expenditure increases, I think, are fairly modest. There's a focus on infrastructure spending, as there has been for many years. I looked at the detail. I didn't think there was a whole lot of new stuff being added. They didn't allocate any additional money to state-owned enterprises. I would say that's good. Even though Transnet clearly needs financial assistance, they're waiting for Transnet to reorganize itself. So there's sort of tough love being applied to the state-owned enterprises, and that would include the post office. And I think that there was no real discussion around national health insurance. So areas like that, the government simply can't entertain expansion within some of these components if they want to be disciplined. So what's missing from the budget? To finish off what's missing, primarily what's missing is how the hell do we grow this economy? If I look at the government's GDP forecast, in 3 years' time, they still don't have GDP growing above 2%. And that's going to be a difficult environment for everybody, for social tension, for social payments, for unemployment. It's just not acceptable. We've got to find a way to lift this growth rate a lot more. And by a lot more, I mean well above 3% and heading to 4%. Keep reminding ourselves that the average emerging market grows at 4.2%. That's the current forecast. And those are the types of numbers South Africa should be aiming for. So I think in my mind, what's missing is a set of urgency about how do we get the growth rate a lot stronger. I think we've got to be realistic in terms of what government is likely to be willing to do. And I think that given all of this, this is a good budget. This kind of achieves the goals that the minister set out in November last year. It's going to please the rating agencies. It'll please the markets. It focuses on fiscal discipline. That is good. But I'm left with a thought that says we're still not fully recognizing how critical, how urgent it is for us to lift the growth rate much more meaningfully. The minister does acknowledge the role of private-public partnerships in doing that, and he is saying we're going to see further use of the private sector in the development of infrastructure. That's good, but we want to see that happen a lot quicker with a lot more urgency and expand into other sectors. I hope that makes some sense. We'll chat again soon, I hope.